Welcome everyone to the DFA Public Speaker Series, sponsored by the DFA, the Dalhousie Faculty Association, and the Halifax Public Libraries. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker for today, Dr. Simon Sherry of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dalhousie. Dr. Simon Sherry directs Dalhousie's personality research team, advancing our understanding of the link between personality and mental health. In his clinical practice, he specializes in treating perfectionism, depression, anxiety, eating disorders, alcohol problems, and personality disorders. Dr. Sherry educates the public about mental health problems in a scientific, non-sensationalized way. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sherry, who will be speaking about perfectionism, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Thank you for joining me this evening. I want to begin by thanking the Dalhousie Faculty Association, in particular Dr. Jason Brown and Miss Catherine Wall, for so very graciously organizing this talk and hosting me here this evening. Some of you may have noted the song I played a few minutes prior to our talk this evening. It's the Bare Naked Ladies of Toronto, Canada, paying tribute to Brian Wilson. Brian Wilson is one of history's notable perfectionists. And what happened to Mr. Wilson is he released an album when he was still playing with the Beach Boys. And in the month or so prior to that, the Beatles had also released an album. And the Beatles album was undeniably brilliant, and Brian Wilson was crushed. Because Brian Wilson was a perfectionist, and he absolutely needed to be the best. And Mr. Wilson didn't take kindly to this perceived defeat. In fact, he took to bed and stayed there for roughly 3 years, where he did drugs, ate excessively, and was quite depressed. Brian Wilson comes by his perfectionism honestly. He was coached up to it by a very critical and controlling father who, among other things, would have him mow the lawn twice to make sure that it was perfect. Now, this album that sent Brian spiraling into a depression was judged by Rolling Stone magazine to probably be the second greatest rock album of all time. But in Brian Wilson's estimation, it was a spectacular failure because it wasn't the best rock album of all time. Very briefly, I have the pleasure of working as a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Dal since at least 1999, when I began my honors thesis. I have researched perfectionism. And in my work as a clinical psychologist, I often assess and treat perfectionism. And I am also the father to a boy who is depicted in 10-month-old version here, but is now older than that. And at a hockey rink tonight, I'm getting live tweet updates from his practice. If you guys ever need to get in touch with me, please feel free to do so. My email address is displayed at the bottom of the screen here. I welcome your questions this evening. What I'm going to suggest is we save them to the end, but we've got a chunk of time to address questions, and I certainly hope we can have a more interactive conversation near the end of my talk tonight. In terms of a game plan, here's a bit of an outline where we may go. I'm going to talk about perfectionism tonight as a personality trait. And the assumption is that perfectionism is relatively stable. In fact, we expect it to be stable across the life course. From womb to tomb, you're going to be fairly perfectionistic if you are a perfectionist. In fact, by maybe around the age of 30, we'd expect you to be the person you're going to be when it comes to perfectionism for the rest of your life. This is a fairly stable individual difference that helps differentiate person A from person B. And we tend to think of perfectionism as lying along a continuum, from having low to no perfectionism to having extreme levels of perfectionism. So we could situate everyone in this library somewhere along this continuum, with one person having more and another person having less. What is perfectionism? To me, it's a double-edged trait. It contains aspects of risk. It puts you at risk for a range of problems, maybe especially mental health problems, but it also contains elements of resilience, and we'll see this in the examples presented here tonight. Exceptional people like Brian Wilson, who strove greatly and suffered greatly throughout their life course. In a more formal sense, there are static aspects to perfectionism. These are relatively stable personality traits. When most people think of perfectionism, they think of someone who must be perfect in just about everything they do, someone who might strive relentlessly toward perfection. And that's certainly part of the definition. That's what we'd call perfectionistic strivings. There are also other key aspects to perfectionism, which we might call perfectionistic concerns. Perfectionists are often intensely self-critical. They'll really rebuke themselves, especially if they've made some sort of a mistake. It's usually a perceived mistake that they react very strongly to. You'll also see with perfectionists that they suffer from a nagging sense of self-doubt. Did I do that perfectly? I think I'm going to go back and check it again to determine whether or not it's perfect. Maybe it isn't. I'll check it again. Perfectionists often have a strong, if not tangible, sense that other people around them need them to be perfect, that other people demand perfection of them. Now, there's a third static or relatively stable personality-like aspect to perfectionism, and these are people who demand perfection of others. Their need for perfection goes outward toward other people, and they can be very critical and very haughty and very demanding in the perfectionistic expectations they rigidly place on others. Now, in our way of thinking of perfectionism, at least, there are also dynamic aspects of perfectionism. Dynamic in the sense that they would ebb and flow, that they might change from day to day or even minute to minute or situation to situation. We know that perfectionists have characteristic patterns of thought, certain cognitions that flare up, like I should be working harder, I must be doing better. And these cognitions can sort of come and go, they're transient. We also know that perfectionists have a certain style of self-presentation, and that can become active in certain situations, where maybe they're going to brashly want to promote an image of perfection to you, or maybe at other times they're going to defensively conceal a sense of imperfection from other people. So that self-presentation style might be really active in a job interview, but less so when you're sitting at home by yourself. So again, the idea there are some parts of perfectionism that can ebb and flow. And lastly, for perfectionists, their tendency to feel they're falling short of expectations can change from day to day, or often from outcome to outcome. Oftentimes perfectionists ride a roller coaster of peaks and valleys as they're achieving and then crashing when they feel they've fallen short of that, and that's more of a dynamic process, a discrepancy that can open or close depending upon perceived outcomes. If we were to try and assess a perfectionist, and this is actual case study data that one of my clients several years ago kindly agreed to have displayed for learning purposes, we would use a questionnaire and largely rely on the input of the individual to appraise themselves in terms of their level of perfectionism. We have at least 30 years of data that's accumulated that this is one valid means by which to assess perfectionists. It's certainly not perfect, though, because oftentimes perfectionists want to create an unrealistically positive self-image, and that may very well affect how they present themselves to other people, even on a piece of paper. So this self-report is an important first step in understanding and assessing perfectionism. And you can see that there's somewhat of a profile here, that this was someone who was extremely demanding of other people, but less concerned about making mistakes, for example. What we find in our research is that the overlap between self-report and what we might call informant report is unsettlingly low. So we get people to report what they believe represents their perfectionistic traits. And that opinion is very important. We don't discount it in any way. But then we gather up people of importance in their life, like a spouse, a friend, or other people who know them well and have known them for some period of time. And the overlap is about 9 or 10% in terms of whether other people agree that they have these perfectionistic traits. And over the years, we've come to have a lot of respect for both opinions, the individual's appraisal of their own perfectionism, as well as the opinion of those around them with regard to how perfectionistic they are. And that respect derives from data that suggests that both self-reports and informant reports of perfectionism are very important predictors of outcomes. This also suggests in a kind of unsettling way that people have a perspective on you that you may not share when it comes to perfectionism, and that perspective counts for something. So how would we optimally assess a perfectionist? We wouldn't do so on the basis of a single consultation. You never really want to pretend you understand somebody's personality based on a 1-hour chat, or worse yet, a 10-minute emergency room consult. If you want to get to know somebody's personality, you assess it repeatedly over time. In terms of a gold standard, you'd also want somebody who is very well trained, who was an expert in human personality, including perfectionism. So that might often be someone like a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And then lastly, you don't want your assessment to depend on just one source of information. You're going to want a wealth of information from self-reports, informant reports, in any sort of collateral information that you can gather, like a resume or some sort of report card or feedback, some sort of information that doesn't go through the filter of a human brain and the biases of self-report. So we've said a little bit about what perfectionism is and how we might assess it. There's a critical point here that I don't want us to look past, and that is what perfectionism is not. Perfectionism is not conscientiousness. Conscientious people are disciplined, they're organized, they're goal-focused, they're reliable, they're dutiful. And conscientiousness is a very important trait that differs meaningfully from perfectionism. These would be a few empirical examples. Take research productivity. Conscientiousness clearly predicts how productive an academic is, how many papers you put out there, how many talks you have, how much grant funding you obtain. But our research has shown that perfectionistic professors publish less, their research gets cited less often, is published in lower impact journals, and they tend to earn less money in terms of their salary and grant dollars. And that's so a clear point of contrast between perfectionism and conscientiousness that can be seen across a range of other domains, including health outcomes and things as dark and important as suicide, where conscientiousness protects against suicide, but we'll see later in our lecture that perfectionism exposes people to the risk of suicide. So conscientiousness and perfectionism are two different things. For perfectionists, they compulsively need to be perfect in just about everything they do, whereas someone who's conscientious will, in a disciplined, organized, goal-focused way, pursue high standards without rigidly needing to be perfect. What causes perfectionism? I suppose the only answer at this point that would be an honest one is we don't know. But we do know from a series of studies that genetics seem to make a contribution, maybe 30, 40, 50%, depending on the estimate, of perfectionism can be attributed to genetics. And we see this all the time where perfectionism runs in families. When I'm assessing someone, I'll ask them about mom, dad, siblings, and you can see that perfectionism runs in families. So it is, to a certain extent, inherited. We're not quite sure what gets inherited at this point, but twin studies point toward perfectionism being heritable. Now we know that there is a neurobiological architecture underlying perfectionism. Shown here, we can see what apparently, under an fMRI, self-criticism looks like. We see activation of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So we can see that there's an underlying brain architecture to things like perfectionism and self-criticism as self-criticism unfolds during the observation of the functioning of the brain. It may very well be that perfectionism is an extreme and misshapen form of something like conscientiousness or neuroticism. It could be that perfectionism is something like conscientiousness on steroids, that this adaptive trait has been taken too far, and in the extreme, it starts to look like perfectionism. Or that neuroticism is a source trait, an origin for perfectionism. We have someone like Sylvia Plath depicted on the left, who's born into the world with an intense and unstable neurotic disposition. She's also extremely conscientious, and maybe over time, through adversity and negative experiences, including the loss of her father, she develops in a perfectionistic direction. My colleagues and I are about to argue that depression may be a very important predictor of perfectionism. And we've got 30 years of research that suggests perfectionism is a very important predictor of depression. But we've been able to show that when people are depressed, they become more self-critical, more concerned over mistakes, more perfectionistic. And so one thing we need to consider is that certain symptom problems, such as certain symptom problems, such as depression, may exacerbate or make worse perfectionism. This is a new idea. The idea is that something like depression might leave behind a scar, and that scar could include changes to your personality, such as making you, on a more lasting way, self-critical or reactive to mistakes. That's Ludwig Wittgenstein. Certainly belongs in the Perfectionism Hall of Fame. He was defending his dissertation with Bertrand Russell, who was probably the most known philosopher in the world at the time. And he got so frustrated with Russell's stupidity that he stormed out of his defense, cursing Bertrand Russell. And he passed his defense because he was Ludwig Wittgenstein and he was a genius. But there's an example of the demandingness of certain perfectionists. Eventually, Wittgenstein ended up living in a cabin by himself, far apart from other people. Wittgenstein was obviously brilliant, a genius, incredibly gifted, and we know that giftedness is a big risk factor for perfectionism. Gifted people seem to suffer under the weight of lofty expectations, and it seems like just because they're brilliant in school doesn't mean that they're going to succeed brilliantly in the world or in other domains of their life, such as relationships. So oftentimes, gifted individuals are highly perfectionistic and tortured at the same time. Now, parenting behaviors quite clearly make a contribution to perfectionism. That's Martha Stewart, depicted along with her daughter, who noted that growing up with Martha was a bit like growing up with a glue gun pointed to your head. That no mistake, no matter how small, was acceptable. And most of what you did in life, you had to do twice because the first time you did it, it was flawed. And so what we know at this point, quite confidently, is that parental psychological control creates an environment conducive to perfectionism developing. Parental psychological control would represent parents who are very harsh, very critical, very micromanaging. They're going to complete your sentence and tell you what you should think and what you should feel. And that type of environment is very invalidating, and it seems quite conducive to perfectionism developing. And I think Alexis Stewart, in her recent book, testifies to this with some force. Now, you can have perfectionism that's situated within an individual. For certain people, it's a largely between the ears phenomenon, having to do with certain individual patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. But perfectionism can also exist within a wider interpersonal context. It could be a mother-daughter relationship. It could be a spousal relationship. And certainly beyond that dyadic level, perfectionism can, it would seem, be embedded in wider environments. Certain subcultures are notoriously perfectionistic, certainly not academics. Ballet school would be a good empirical example of a place that seems to select for perfectionistic people and then expect perfectionism of those individuals, teaching them to be intensely self-critical and self-scrutinizing. So sometimes perfectionism is more than just an individual issue. It can be a dyadic issue existing in a relationship between a supervisor and a supervisee, or existing in a wider milieu. My colleagues and I have recently argued that Western world may very well be part of that wider milieu, that we live in a world where a lot of attention is paid to rank and dominance and self-interest. And in such a world, that's conducive to the development of perfectionism, and that part of that larger sociocultural milieu may also be something like the relentless bombardment of all of us by social media and media images that are extremely unrealistic. You're constantly getting images that have been airbrushed and photoshopped and otherwise tweaked, sent to you through Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and the like. And in that world, there are now so many drivers of perfectionism, because you can see who had the best March break. How nice is your best friend's new house or husband or whatever other yardstick you may wish to measure yourself on. And so we are concerned in the research we're doing that we're living in an age of perfectionism. And consistent with that, we recently meta-analyzed 77 different studies, which is really just a fancy way of saying empirically synthesized 77 different studies involving more than 25,000 participants. And what we found was from 1990 to 2015, there's been a clear increase in levels of perfectionism, and that perfectionism would be peaking in what we might call today's generation of millennials. So perfectionism is a rising concern in this world. We'll talk now a little bit about important links between perfectionism and various forms of mental health difficulties. First, considering the question of if there's a link between perfectionism and various problems. As shown here, there are absolutely links between perfectionism and various mental health problems. If you forced me to pick what are currently the two most important and what will 100 years from now be the two most important, undoubtedly it would be mood disorders and eating disorders. There are incredibly important relationships between perfectionism and mood difficulties and a range of eating difficulties, including bulimia, binge eating, anorexia nervosa, and other such eating problems. We also know that perfectionists really struggle in relationships, and that they have a range of other mental and physical health problems depicted here. Sadly, there are 2 credible studies suggesting that perfectionists may actually die earlier as compared to non-perfectionists, in part because they get so stressed out throughout the course of their life. Now, one thought here is that perfectionism may be a risk factor that cuts across many major mental health problems. You know, we like to pretend that you can slice up mental health problems, that somehow anxiety is really meaningfully different from depression. What we tend to think of is that underlying mental health difficulties for certain individuals, you will find perfectionism. And sometimes it's going to contribute to their anxiety. At other points, it may contribute to binge eating. At a different phase in their life, it might be stress, panic, or depression. But underlying their difficulties would be having a perfectionistic personality. And so we tend to think of across diagnostic categories, perfectionism may very well be a risk factor for a range of problems. It's sometimes described as a core vulnerability factor. Vulnerability in the sense of it places you at risk for the development of a range of problems. We also know that perfectionism seems to be present prior to the onset of an illness. So that's important. If we're trying to argue that perfectionism puts you at risk for problems, we better be able to show that at age 18, your perfectionism is a good predictor of your depression at age 22, for example. And so it looks like perfectionism is a pre-morbid risk factor for mental health problems. In other words, perfectionism seems to be present before the onset of something like depression. Now, it may very well be the case when depression or anorexia nervosa or other mental health problems get going, that perfectionism gets worse, that there's a worsening, an exacerbation of levels of perfectionism when you're in the throes of extreme anxiety or bulimia nervosa, to give you two examples. It also looks like after the major mental health problem like depression or anxiety or binge eating goes away, perfectionism tends to persist. So even after the symptoms go away, the personality traits seem like they remain. And of course, that's risky, especially if those were the traits that resulted in the mental health problem to begin with. Now, it is our position that perfectionism influences the various stages that might go along with major mental health problems. Depression would be a good example. There's a period where you go from normal and progress downward into having some sort of mental health problem, where you've got some symptoms of depression, and then eventually you could get mired in having something like a major depressive episode, a serious diagnosable episode of depression. What we've been able to show is that perfectionism hastens the progress toward going from normal to having a mental health problem. And then unfortunately, depression seems to influence the climb back to being well. So it influences how well you respond to various therapies, and maybe to a lesser extent, how well you respond to medications. And then unfortunately, if you do start to get better, perfectionism places you at risk for your symptoms returning, for your symptoms coming back. So in other words, perfectionism can predict a relapse. And one thought might be that psychologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals, we address symptoms, but we don't address the underlying personality traits. So we chase away the symptoms, we discharge the patient, and they're still vulnerable to the return of their problem because we never dealt with the underlying perfectionism that was driving the depression to begin with. And then hopefully people eventually can reach a state of recovery where whatever was ailing them is chased away. But unfortunately, perfectionism predicts a return to symptoms even after you've been recovered for a while. So it's our contention, based on research, that perfectionism can influence various phases of the process of becoming ill and recovering. As alluded to briefly, there's a robust link between perfectionism and depression, especially the unipolar version of depression. We're not so sure if perfectionism is linked to bipolar forms of depression. In the bipolar form of depression, you're going to have episodes of mania or hypomania where your mood spikes and becomes elated. We don't think that perfectionism predicts that well, but it's certainly a robust predictor of the low, flat, negative, depressive phase of this illness. And perfectionism predicts not only episodes of depression that might last several months, but also chronic forms of depression that can be around not just for months, but for years. So depression that can persist for a very long time is robustly predicted by depression. Unfortunately, perfectionism is also strongly related to self-harm, and there's an even clearer link to suicide. My colleagues and I in 2018 did a comprehensive study looking at the links between perfectionism and depression. And even after you take into account major, extremely well-studied risk factors for suicide, like hopelessness and like depression, there's still a role for perfectionism in predicting suicide. And we were glad to put this research out because I think it surprised a lot of people how strong the link was, and that it persisted even after taking into account very important predictors of suicide behavior. And perfectionists can often be very challenging to understand and to help when it comes to suicidal behaviors, because they'll show you an image of perfect. They'll present that facade. They won't show you their actual or perceived imperfections beneath it. Sadly, my colleagues had a case study where someone passed through their research, was assessed by skilled clinicians quite thoroughly, including questions on suicide, offered no information that was concerning, and then within a week died by suicide. And so that person came to the study, behaved as a perfectionist would, which is creating ostensibly an image of perfection, that everything's okay, without ever opening up and sharing their underlying distress. And for that reason, perfectionism can often be a very serious risk factor for suicide behaviors. We also know that perfectionism has a very strong and compelling link to disordered eating. It's closely aligned with anorexia nervosa, very closely aligned with bulimia nervosa, and there's a robust link there as well to binge eating. Something like binge eating can be so painful for a perfectionist too. They want to be perfect. They want to maintain strict control over their weight, their shape, their size, and their eating. They want to have that perfect body. They've internalized this image of perfection that we see in Cosmo and the like. And then they lose control and they binge. And that is such a painful failure for someone who is perfectionistic. They become intensely self-critical. They suffer a lot in terms of their mood. And then the next day, they decide, I'm going to be perfect. I'm going to go back. I'm going to live by my rules. I'm going to be harshly restrictive. Today's going to be my perfect day. And then the cycle renews itself. So often perfectionists are wrapped up in a very painful cycle of binging and trying to compensate. And some of the largest levels of perfectionism that have been observed across thousands of studies over the last 30 years are in women with anorexia nervosa. Some people have argued, I think with good cause, that anorexia nervosa for some women is actually perfectionism played out in the domain of weight, shape, size, and eating. In other words, perfectionism is so central to their eating disorder. It's just one and the same. It's just perfectionism expressing it around mealtime, around restriction, around dietary choices. Certainly, perfectionists often struggle with various forms of anxiety, including panic, generalized forms of anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder has a close link. Perfectionists can often be very socially anxious too. They want to please you. They want to be perfect. They would hate this experience because they might show their imperfections and have them captured on television. It can be very, very anxiety-provoking to operate in your world needing to be perfect. There's a lot of anxiety behind perfectionism. And what we've been able to show in a fairly recent study is that being a perfectionist at one point in time sets you up to have an anxiety problem further down the road, even after we take into account how anxious you were at baseline. So the best predictor of anxiety is always going to be anxiety, but we were able to show that above and beyond your baseline level of anxiety, perfectionism still predicts you becoming more anxious over time. Now, perfectionism doesn't just intersect with major mental health problems like depression and anxiety. Perfectionism also overlaps with other traits. In fact, it would be extremely rare for someone to wander into my office who is just purely perfectionistic, because personality traits rarely exist in just isolation. So over the last few years, we've looked at the idea there might be a collision in human personality between perfectionism and narcissism. And this is sort of the coming together of these two traits. So on the perfectionism side, you've got people who need other people to be perfect. And then on the narcissism side, you've got this special, unique, important individual who feels entitled to perfect treatment from others. So these two traits often come together. Maybe you've seen an example before of how these two traits can collide. Steve Jobs, undoubtedly a brilliant man, has been chronicled extensively as being a perfectionist of the narcissistic sort. You were a hero or you were a zero with Steve Jobs, and you could move quite quickly from one category to another. When he was out dining, he would often send his food back as many as 3 times until the chef cooked it perfectly for him. Near the end of his life, he refused life-saving care because the machines that were providing it to him were designed in an imperfect way, so he wouldn't use them. It took him 67 nurses before he could find 3 that he liked. If he would go into a restaurant and he was unhappy with the organization of his table, he would ask that it be moved to a more perfect location, regardless of who it displaced. His poor wife, I believe, number 2, had to sit on the floor for many years as important people visited Steve Jobs in his multi-million-dollar mansion because he couldn't find a couch that he deemed worthy to sit on. He couldn't find a perfectly designed couch, so he just decided to sit on the floor. And Jobs was very, very hard on other people. Walter Isaacs has written the definitive biography of Jobs, and eventually I just had to stop because page after page after page was Steve Jobs being angry and coming into conflict with other people. He was very hard on others, despite obviously being a genius. So we've shown that there seems to be a relationship between perfectionism and a range of mental health difficulties. But that still leaves some important and unanswered questions. Like, when is it that perfectionism is likely to result in difficulties? Now, some perfectionists will go along just fine for a while until something bad happens. There's nothing wrong with being a perfectionist as long as everything is perfect. But when imperfection and stressors and difficulties come along, that's often the times when we see perfectionists having trouble. I was doing my residency at the University of Washington in the inpatient psychiatry unit, part of a 4-month rotation. And for months, I did not see a perfectionist. I started thinking to myself, what am I doing? Where is the applied practical relevance of my research if no perfectionists show up who are distressed? And then exams came around. And then you started to see perfectionists, typically in the context of a suicidal crisis or some acute worsening of their mood. So perfectionism would interact with achievement stress to produce self-harm, suicide behavior, and depression. Sometimes you don't see the problems that accompany perfectionism until there's just the wrong stressor. And what's the wrong stressor for a perfectionist? Usually one that hits home, that taps into their ego, maybe like their need to achieve perfectly on an exam. We've also got to pay some attention to why is it that perfectionists have mental health difficulties. This is a question of mechanism, and this is a very important one to therapists. If we can figure out, for example, that perfectionists get depressed because they're constantly stressed, well, maybe we can help perfectionists become less stressed and cope more effectively. So this question of why is a critical one. So looking at these questions of when and why, we know that perfectionists have a difficult relationship with the self. Might sound a little odd, but most of us in North America would accept that we have self-esteem or self-knowledge or self-worth. And that's a relationship with yourself, how you feel about yourself or what you think you know about yourself. Unfortunately, perfectionists have a difficult, harsh relationship with the self. They have lower levels of self-esteem on average, and when their self-esteem is high, it's variable. Their self-esteem is often contingent. It depends. Perfectionists are usually as good as their last achievement outcome. If that was perfect on a test, they're okay, but perfect is a difficult thing to keep up, and when there's something less than perfect, then their self-esteem can plummet. So the esteem of a perfectionist often depends, and there can be a chronic and nagging sense of discrepancy there. Here's where I am, here's where perfect is. I can't seem to close the gap. That discrepancy is often very distressing for perfectionists. And sadly, and I'll see this not uncommonly in my work, some perfectionists are caught in a paradox where they're extremely competent, maybe even uber competent, spectacularly competent, and they loathe themselves. High self-confidence, but low self-worth. You would think if you're a very capable and very competent human, you'd feel all right about yourself. But they get caught in this paradoxical state where they can achieve a lot, really impressive, but their self-esteem is still in the toilet. For perfectionists, their self-worth often has a number attached to it. So your graduate record exams or your MCAT exams or your SAT exams are often a metric, a yardstick that you can use to measure your worth. Now, perfectionists really can struggle in relationships. We spend most of our time around other people, maybe about 80% of our time around other people, and if you're not relating effectively to other people, it can have profound and negative impacts on your mood and your health in other ways. Perfectionists often think that other people are quite displeased with them. You know, there's a lot of meaning making that goes on in our social world, and perfectionists are often defective detectives in the sense they try and read people in their world. Are you looking attentively, or are you judging me right now? It takes some decoding to get to that point. And perfectionists seem to make a lot of unflattering inferences that other people are being critical and harsh and judgmental and thinking negatively about them. Perfectionists can also struggle with playing nicely with other people. Their social behaviors can often be quite hostile, because they think other people are demanding perfection of them. They can lash out in angry ways. Perfectionists can be quite conflictual. We've studied, for example, people in romantic relationships and looked on a day-to-day basis. And perfectionism tends to predict a lot of conflict that unfortunately resembles forms of emotional and verbal abuse in our research. Perfectionists can often be quite angry. Now, we know less about this last social challenge for perfectionists, but we're starting to learn that maybe perfectionism predicts things like the breakup of romantic relationships. And you can imagine that if you're having social problems in terms of your behavior and having social problems in terms of how you're thinking, maybe eventually that has a corrosive effect on things like love and wears down the bonds that tend to hold people together in relationships. Ernest Hemingway, brilliant writer, Nobel Prize winner, and notorious perfectionist. You can see in his example some of the challenges of perfectionism. He had insufferably high standards for himself. And these are some of the words that others have used to describe him, like tyrannical and cruel. He was very hard on other people. And through most of his life, Hemingway struggled with a great sense of isolation from other people despite pushing them away. And his mood suffered accordingly. He wrestled with depression for most of his life and unfortunately eventually died by suicide. Now, we've talked about how perfectionists may have difficulties with the self-esteem, for example. We've talked about how perfectionists will have problems in relating to other people. But one really key situation where perfectionists run into trouble has to do with stress. And I'll tell you the sad tale of Frank Clure of Warrnambool, Australia. Mr. Clure was recently unemployed, and he was seeking a new job. To create a good impression, he donned his best woolen sweater and his nylon jacket and headed out into the world to conduct a job interview at a major downtown apartment complex. In fact, it was the largest complex in Warrnambool, Australia. He got into his car and he drove. He was having his coffee as he was driving. And the first sign Frank had that maybe something was amiss was when he put down his coffee cup to exit the car and the cup melted. But Frank was in a hurry. He didn't need this explained. He needed to hustle off to get to his interview. And so he was walking hurriedly to his interview, moving throughout his world. And he walked across the lush carpets of Warrnambool, Australia's largest apartment complex. And the carpet burst into flames as he was walking across it. This is a true story, confirmed from multiple sources. It then set off all the fire alarms in the building as he created these flames, as he walked across the carpet. What had happened is the unfortunate combination of wool and nylon that he put on that day created tens of thousands of volts of electricity. Frank became a bit of a sensation because a few more volts and he may have spontaneously combusted. This hasn't happened yet on record, but he caught several things on fire. What does this have to do with perfectionists? Well, we've been studying perfectionists on a day-to-day basis since at least 2005. We've put perfectionism under a microscope, sometimes studying perfectionists multiple times per day, at other points studying them for as many as 28 days in a row. And what you see with perfectionists is they generate a lot of friction, not unlike Frank Clore. As they go about their day-to-day life, oftentimes they're not even intending to, but they create a lot of friction. That friction can rub people the wrong way, and sometimes that friction results in other sorts of explosions, like an explosion of drinking or binge eating or ill temper. So perfectionists generate an awful lot of stress, often unwittingly, as they go about their day-to-day life, and that sets the stage for a lot of mental health difficulties, like stress that leads to anxiety or stress that leads to depression. What we think is that across the life course, perfectionists may be differentially exposed to stress. In other words, by virtue of having the personality trait of perfectionism, across their life, perfectionists end up being more stressed. And consistent with that notion, not too long ago, we hooked perfectionists up to heart rate monitors and checked in on their heart for 14 consecutive days. And you could see that on a biological level, they were often more stressed than non-perfectionists. And shortly after that, we checked in with perfectionists in terms of their cortisol levels, which is a biomarker of stress. And you could see again that perfectionists really were stressed out in terms of this biomarker of being in a state of sympathetic nervous system arousal. Perfectionists are often stressed out. And that stress can be cardiovascular, it can be hormonal, and we know the most about the cognitive stress that perfectionists feel, which often has to do with being time pressured, feeling like they're falling behind, and just feeling crushed by a sense of stress that's very subjective. The sixth question here is a relevant one. And I should caution moving into it that the treatment of perfectionism is in its infancy. We've only really had the empirical study of perfectionism since about 1990. So we're really only getting going when it comes to understanding, can we treat, can we change perfectionism? Now, in light of what I presented, I'm going to argue that treating perfectionism is an important aim. That maybe for certain people, obviously not all people, but for certain people with certain mental health problems, perfectionism is a key maintaining factor. And so you may see someone whose anxiety is almost entirely driven by their perfectionism. And until they're going to defeat their anxiety, you have to remove that perfectionism. And sometimes when you remove perfectionism, not unlike a house of cards, the entire problem will collapse. Now, obviously, that doesn't apply to everyone. There are many reasons why people get anxious in this world. But for a subset of people, their perfectionism may be the central maintaining mechanism in why they're getting anxious, depressed, bulimic, and so forth. So what do we have? This might be, from a methodological standpoint, one of our better studies. It's quite optimistic off the start because it looks like across the initial phases of treatment, we can put a real dent in perfectionism. In this case, the authors used a very reasonable, very defensible form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which would have looked at styles of thinking typical of perfectionists. This might be an extreme form of thinking where everything's seen as black and white, perfect or imperfect, right or wrong, changing around a style of thinking like that, as well as targeting patterns of behavior we know that perfectionists are prone to, like I'm going to do this perfectly or I'm not going to do it at all. And so cognitive behavioral therapy looks like it has a fairly favorable effect on perfectionism, especially in the early phases. It doesn't look quite as optimistic, though, when you follow up 4 months later and you can see that there's a bit of a rebound. So those initially favorable treatment gains start to erode over time, which doesn't really make me pessimistic. If you want to change something that's relatively fixed like personality, maybe we're going to need more than a couple months in order to do that. So to get a long-term outcome, we may need to treat perfectionists in an acute phase where we might see them once or twice a week, and then support them over time so we don't see this erosion of treatment gains. So maybe to get a long-term outcome, we need a longer-term intervention. It also looks like one way you can help people become less perfectionistic is to treat the problems that accompany it. So we know if we reduce levels of depression, social anxiety, OCD, generalized anxiety, the levels of perfectionism also tend to fall. Now, they don't tend to fall in a dramatic way, but oftentimes the condition like depression can be making perfectionism worse, and so why not alleviate the depression, the social anxiety, or so forth. That doesn't seem to result in dramatic changes, but a small and consistent change is an important change nonetheless. Now, one of the problems we have in treating perfectionism is a bit of a porcupine problem. And the porcupine problem is such that porcupines are often out in nature in difficult circumstances where it can be cold and wet, not unlike, say, November in Halifax. And porcupines, being clever creatures, recognize the benefits of coming together, of closeness, of belonging, of being connected to others. And so porcupines move closer together only to discover that it's hard to get close to somebody when you're a porcupine because there are prickly qualities about porcupines. So they come together and they disperse, having hurt one another. But they need to come together being humans, and so they try and get close to one another again, only to be repelled by those prickly and disagreeable traits. Now, the interpersonal problems that perfectionists have outside of my office often come inside of my office. And I welcome that because it gives us an opportunity to work on them in real time. But it looks like perfectionism creates problems in treatment. When treatment works, delivered by a psychologist or another mental health professional, oftentimes there's a real sense of team, a real sense of alliance. We have shared goals, we're pulling in the same direction. I like you, you like me. Let's get her done. And it looks like perfectionism in some ways attacks that alliance, making that relationship more difficult. It also seems like perfectionists really don't like arbitrary termination dates, and I can understand that. To say, okay, this research study ends after 15 sessions. It seems like they start to pull back based on those arbitrary constraints. So we know that perfectionism may, in some small to moderate ways, be treatable, especially if we were to follow up with perfectionists over time to assist them in maintaining the gains in treatment. On the other hand, less optimistically, perfectionism can slow down the therapy process. Perfectionists will often arrive in my office quite distressed because they've delayed seeking help for a long time. They don't want to come forward, undergo therapy, and have to talk about in an extended way what they would think of as their imperfections. And so therapists working with perfectionists also have to appreciate not only are they going to arrive more distressed, but you have to build a relationship with somebody who can sometimes be tricky in how they relate to other people. It's also the case that perfectionism can interfere with things like task completion. I see it all the time. Perfectionists will try and do a homework task, some sort of out-of-session assignment perfectly, and then they end up procrastinating, they get crushed by the pressure of it, and it never gets done. So you have to actively work on those things in treatment. You also have to be careful because we really know that perfectionism can slow down progress in treatment. In some ways, perfectionism is treatment interfering. It trips therapists up along the way to helping their patients, in part because they'll try and do things perfectly and it creates failures that then stress them out. We know that perfectionists will also tend to drop out of therapy unless the therapist is quite active in helping them remain engaged. So perfectionism is a personality trait, and personality traits don't change quickly, but we're starting to learn more and more that maybe perfectionism is something that can change. And maybe what we need to do is deliver longer-term interventions to people when we're trying to do something as bold as change someone's personality. Back to where we started. Brian Wilson underwent literally thousands of hours of psychotherapy. Some of it was delivered in a horribly quacky way. Some of it was delivered in a rather evidence-based and effective way. And over time, Brian Wilson started to get better. Eventually, he got out of bed and got back to work. In fact, in 2008, he released an album that was beloved by critics. He began that album in 1966. It took him 42 years to complete his album. This is some of the challenges that go along with perfectionism. And despite undergoing thousands of hours and I'm sure hundreds of thousands of dollars of therapy, this is how Brian Wilson summed up his perfectionism. There's an example of a perfectionist, someone who achieved brilliantly and suffered greatly throughout his life. With that, I'll bring my talk to an end. I certainly welcome questions from any and all of you. Thank you kindly for your attention. What are you guys wondering about it, if anything?
So, am I to understand that on the fMRI, that young people can be demonstrated to have a section of their brains that demonstrates perfectionism, and so then it's going to be a combination of biology and nurturing or parenting?
Yes, absolutely. Perfectionism is going to represent a collision between nature and nurture. It looks like perfectionists are born into the world with a predisposition toward being perfectionistic. And so what's inherited quite likely is some sort of underlying brain structure and function that we're not so clear on. But then the thought would be that that predisposition collides with certain stressful events. And that could very well be a parent who is harshly critical. We know that early adversity, which is really just a euphemistic way of saying abuse, tends to predict perfectionism. So the idea is that this predisposition then runs into a lot of adversity in the environment, and that shapes people in being more perfectionistic. Good question.
In one of your slides, you kind of implied that there were like highs and lows in how the perfectionism happened in a life. Are
Yes.
there other personality characteristics that can lead to those same high and low cycles?
Yes, absolutely. Perfectionism hasn't cornered the market on a roller coaster of emotions or intense and unstable relationships. Other examples of traits that would do that would be something like narcissism. Those folks can ride a lot of peaks and valleys. There are other difficulties like borderline personality disorder, where core to the definition of the problem is intense and unstable emotions and relationships. In a less pathological, more garden variety way, we've got personality traits like neuroticism, where people just have sort of intense, negative, and unstable emotions. So there are all sorts of traits that can predict peaks and valleys in terms of mood and in terms of relationship functioning.
I'm going to ask a question. So, you've mentioned Steve Jobs as being a perfectionist. So what is the connection between creativity and perfectionism? Because I would imagine, as a researcher, I realize mistakes are an integral part of doing research and the creative process. And yet you have people who are perfectionists who seem to be very creative.
Great question. I wonder about, for the Steve Jobs of the world or Brian Wilson or others, if they achieved greatness in their field not because of their perfectionism, but in spite of it. That it was something actually tripping them up along the way to success. To give an empirical answer to your question, it looks like perfectionism does hamper creativity. And I think that's in part because perfectionism involves a play-it-safe, risk-aversive approach. And perfectionists can be very intolerant of failure. For example, Sylvia Plath, who is a very notable perfectionist, who went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, but also died by suicide at age 30. She applied to Young Miss magazine. She'd been, at a very young age, a distinguished writer, and Young Miss couldn't take her on that summer for an internship. So she took a massive overdose, went underneath the family porch, and they couldn't find her for days. It should have been a fatal overdose, but for whatever reason, she survived. So perfectionists can be really intolerant of mistakes and adverse to taking risks. They won't always color outside of the lines. Now, they can be enormously talented and extremely persistent and keep pushing and suffering to an unreasonable degree as well. And that's where you get some of the double-edged nature of this trait. Yeah, that's a great question. And the question is something along the lines of, how does an inferiority complex link up to perfectionism? I think one of the sad things about perfectionism is that it's often driven by a sense of inadequacy and inferiority. And you can see people who have sometimes achieved an awful lot who feel unnecessarily like a loser. And they're trying to always be perfect. And I think one thing about trying to be perfect is it greatly increases the degree to which you bump into failure. If you're going for perfect, you're often going to have failure. And some people are quite intolerant of that, and other people can live with it. But a lot of perfectionists are extremely intolerant of perceived failure. They set the bar so high, inevitably they fall short. And so what you can see in the lives of a lot of perfectionists is a high frequency of perceived failure and a low frequency of perceived success. And that's a great setup for depression. If there's a lot of punishment and not a lot of reward, you can really end up being depressed. So I do think a sense of inferiority and a fear of failure, those are kind of baseline problems for perfectionists that can drive a lot of their behavior.
I have two questions. Number one, are you a perfectionist?
That's on my FAQ list. I should put that on my website or something. I would say no. You'd have to ask my wife, though. She says I demand perfection of other people.
And number two, how can perfectionism be channeled to make this world a better place?
That's a good question. Absolutely, especially because perfectionism seems to be on the rise. I think what we need to do is start early and figure out those children who have this predisposition and just help them dial it back a bit. Help them be more conscientious, less perfectionistic. There's nothing wrong with having high standards for your children, for example. There's nothing wrong with expecting them to be excellent. But what you see with parents who are raising perfectionists, they cross a line into being hypercritical and hostile. They cross a line into being too demanding and too controlling. So I think we need to take some of the basic building blocks of perfectionism and just raise people differently so they end up more conscientious and less perfectionistic. Great questions.
I'm going to take the mic over here, but I'm going to ask another question since I have the mic. What about, how do perfectionists, can they see themselves at the meta level, look down at themselves and see how they're acting? And in conjunction with that, can you teach them, for instance, to laugh at themselves? Do they have a sense of humor, or is that something that's often lacking?
Two really good questions. To the first one about a meta level, which is sort of, can you get a bird's eye view of yourself? Some people have argued that that's one way we need to help perfectionists, to help them be able to think about their own thinking, to be able to step back from their own thoughts and realize, okay, this is my perfectionism unfolding again. Not to get too caught up in their own thinking, so they can step back and disengage. In psychology, we're going to want to call this kind of stuff metacognitive awareness, and that can be useful. In terms of perfectionism, it varies like most conditions along a continuum of insight. Some perfectionists really don't understand the impact they have on other people. They seem oblivious to the degree to which they might be demanding of their spouse, or simply see the spouse as a problem, right? I'm not demanding. My wife is imperfect. So we really need to foster, I think, an understanding of how perfectionists think and also how they impact other people, because they usually underestimate the impact they have on others. You also asked about humor and coping. At least in undergraduates, it seems to be the case that perfectionists make dark use of humor. I think humor is great. I love laughter. But there are darker applications of it. And so sometimes it's like perfectionists use humor more as a defense, or sometimes as another vehicle for self-criticism. Like their humor is heavily laced with self-abuse, which can be funny, except not really. You see comedians who have that bent. Good question again.
Hi, thanks for your talk, really interesting stuff.
You're welcome.
I think you've touched upon this already, so this might be somewhat repetitive, but have you ever explored the relationship between perfectionism and sort of hyper-competitiveness?
Yes, absolutely. It's a great question. And I love that word when it comes to perfectionism. It seems like perfectionists have a really specifically malignant form of hypercompetitiveness. Like, I love competitive people. I really do. I'm not trying to disparage them in any way. But there's a dark form of hypercompetitiveness where you need to squash other people in order to feel good about yourself. Steve Jobs hated Bill Gates. Just hated him. They could have coexisted happily as brilliant billionaires, but no, he needed to best and to beat IBM and his competitors. There was no collaboration there. And what you see that with perfectionists all the time. They don't take a collaborative stance with others. Other people aren't individuals you cooperate with. They're competitors to be squashed. So that hyper-competitive word is a really good one. And there's a couple studies on that, and there's a couple more sitting on my hard drive that back up those statements. Good question again.
Thank you so much for the talk. I see a lot of myself in this talk. I've always been really open about my own circumstance. I have high-functioning generalized anxiety disorder with perfectionism, OCD, and some depressive tendencies. And I went through CBT for it, and it was helpful. I also work in the medical industry. And I guess the medical industry can be a really tricky one because a mistake in some cases can quite literally be fatal. And I guess, how do you deal with or help people, and a lot of people in the medical field do end up being people that are they have a lot of perfectionism struggles, and I talk to a lot of them about it. What sorts of supports or what different ways could we help people in an industry like that where perfectionism is so prevalent, and it's mostly because, like I said, if you make a mistake, it could be relatively minor. It could also be fatal. You want to talk about like a perfectionist nightmare? That's it, right there.
So we know, very consistent with what you're saying, that perfectionism tends to be overrepresented in medical students, and to a lesser degree, it looks like, when I say to a lesser degree, we've got a ton of studies showing perfectionism is elevated in med students because they're a captive audience and they're easy to do research on. Less research we see with actual medical professionals, but even those few studies point towards perfectionism being elevated. I think what happens is medical professions select for highly conscientious people, and in doing so, they pull in some perfectionists as well. I think, to take a few steps back from your question, that we're now living in a world that's highly intolerant of mistakes, and that mistakes are now greeted with instant censure and prohibition. You can see that very strongly on university campuses. Sometimes I dread speaking in public, lest I make a mistake and say the wrong thing in what seems to be a very politically correct world. I certainly understand what you're talking about when some contexts or subcultures are intolerant of mistakes. And I've met my share of medical professionals who wrestle with that. And sadly, I've seen medical mistakes in the case study literature be an occasion for suicide, where people make mistakes and they just will not forgive themselves and they think it's a disaster. How do you help people with that? Well, you help them decatastrophize their mistakes. You help them normalize their mistakes. You help them do the very painful work of accepting their mistakes and humanizing their mistakes. And a lot of time, what you do is, within the discipline of being a therapist, you care for them and show compassion towards them and help them accept their mistakes. You model what you'd like to see in them, which is an accepting, compassionate stance toward a mistake, even when it's enormously painful. I see that paradox all the time in people. They can be so incredibly hard on the self, but yet really kind to their children or their co-workers and whatnot. And so some people have argued that one way we can tackle this perfectionism challenge is by teaching compassion, which is in part a skill set around what you feel and what you think and how you behave. But I think a lot of the teaching of compassion is having a relationship, usually of a longer term, with someone like a therapist who can be compassionate, who can be caring. I think there's some healing in that experience. Good questions.
So just along those lines, I'm also a musician, so I've always preferred playing jazz to playing classical music, because jazz, you don't have the same litmus test of perfection. So I'm wondering, are people drawn in their professional life to, perfectionists are drawn to professions where perfection is the standard, or does the profession create perfectionists from people who might not otherwise be perfectionists?
Great observation, and I think the answer is both. Taking a step back from the question, there's actually a half dozen studies on perfectionism and musicians, and those studies suggest that perfectionism fuels quite a bit of performance anxiety among musicians and can trip them up along the way to performing. When it comes to perfectionists and their occupations, I think that perfectionists often select themselves into certain contexts, or perhaps get funneled into certain contexts by parents. So an example would be gunning to get into med school, joining ballet school. They get into these elite, hyper-competitive environments where perfection is often expected, where they face a lot of scrutiny, where there is a lot of judgment and criticism, maybe in the guise of feedback, present on a day-to-day basis. And so they arrive perfectionistic, and then the environment systematically rewards or punishes them for being perfect or imperfect. And what that does is strengthen their disposition.
Great, thank you. Are there any more questions?
I'm getting the impression that this is far more prevalent and even insidious than we realize, because I'm just seeing parts of myself here, and it's like, oh my God, that's why I don't do that, or this, because it's insidious. You don't even realize that it boils down to this.
More and more perfectionism seems to be on the rise. There's our study, which I mentioned, with the 25,000 students, and about 6 months prior, there was a major British study with tens of thousands of people as well that suggests perfectionism is on the rise. And it may have sort of a slow creeping growth because no one's really saying, hey, is this a bad thing? You know, this is a thing that people mention in their job application. Tell me about one of your weaknesses. Well, I guess I'm a bit too much of a perfectionist. People don't really recognize it as a problem, and I don't blame some parents, but some of them will proudly boast about their kids a perfectionist. So that is in part what brings me to a talk like tonight, where we can give away some of the information we've learned over the last 2 or 3 decades. And clearly, there are environments that reward and expect perfection out there as well. And those situations are making a contribution to the rise of perfectionism over the last 25 years. I think most perfectionists are aware that they deal with perfectionism, especially if they have that tendency to demand it of the self. Like, I need to be perfect in everything I do, or I can't stop working until what I'm doing is perfect. I think that there becomes problems of insight around the tendency for other people to need you to be perfect, Like, you could really think that your boss needs you to be perfect, and that may very well not be the case, because it's based on that social cognition we talked about, that sort of detective work we all have to do. And then the real unfortunate blind spot is with narcissistic perfectionists. They're not demanding you're the problem and you better step your game up. There's definitely a problem of insight with most of those folks. Yeah, absolutely. Just draw out your social network and they're the person stressing you out the most. For sure.
Second part here, I guess. I look at procrastination, for example. So do we not start to do something because we are afraid that, well, we're not going to do it right anyway, so you don't even start it? Day-to-day tasks.
When you're a perfectionist, trying is the first step toward failure. So oftentimes you don't try. I didn't mention it tonight. One could say I'm remiss for not mentioning it. But there's a really robust link between perfectionism and procrastination. And I do think for some perfectionists it's paralytic, just needing to be perfect. You just can't really get past the terror of that empty page, for example. Or you'll see perfectionists who will research and they'll make a plan, an incredibly detailed list, and never get the assignment in. You know, oftentimes there's a huge investment in time and effort, but they can't necessarily pull the trigger and get the assignment in. And not only does this have something to do with procrastination, but if you take a few steps back, a lot of perfectionists struggle with what you might call avoidance behavior. Sometimes it's not doing a task. Other times it might just be sleeping the day away, avoiding life by just shutting her down. They can also escape through other means. Alcohol, cannabis, even binge eating can be an escape for perfectionists, because if you have a lot of negative thoughts about yourself, taking down a pizza in a hurry will help block that out. So for sure there's a link between perfectionism and avoidance, maybe especially procrastination.
You mentioned a couple of things. You said that a good way to address perfectionism is during its infancy.
Yes.
But sometimes the parents that could do this, or the people that could do this, are perfectionists themselves, so they are the ones pushing the children.
Yes.
The other thing is, you also said that, okay, that's fast. Let me summarize.
If I could speak to your first point, because I think it's a good one. Yes, in many ways we might not be able to entrust parents to turn around perfectionism because of what we talked about earlier, where perfectionism runs in families. So what some of my colleagues have been doing is trying prevention at a school-wide level to put out programs that wouldn't just touch on one kid, but that would touch on an entire school of children. And there's some modest evidence that suggests that might be an approach that works. And you can weave into those types of interventions more learning about eating disorders and depression and the things that perfectionists seem to be at risk for. I really like the idea of educating kids today about how the game's rigged when it comes to Instagram, social media and the like, photoshopped, airbrushed, artificial images they're constantly being bombarded with. So I think absolutely we shouldn't just be entrusting this work to parents.
You also mentioned about compassion. How can we make compassion cool enough to compete with perfectionism? And would you recommend things like, what do you say, those things, the people that put people to sleep and then, yeah, things like that, or like that would backtrack it and try and resolve it? Or when we catch it as adults, or with the prevalence of mental health in the society now, and how do we balance all this to make compassion more cool?
Okay. Well, Paul Gilbert, who's a psychologist over in the UK, runs what's called the Compassionate Mind Foundation. He's got a website you can find, and I think he's done a good job of making compassion pretty cool. Over in Britain, it's become more of an intervention, and I think it's a good one. In America, we've got a psychologist by the last name of Neff who's done a good job popularizing compassion as well. For what it's worth, I prefer Gilbert's work quite a bit. As for how do we go back and sort this out, I think it's really important to go back. I won't be hypnotizing anyone, but when I do therapy with perfectionists, I really want to know their backstory, their developmental history. I want to wrap my mind around the conditions that shaped their perfectionism, because for a perfectionist, the past is never past. It's always bubbling up. And it has a lot to do with interactions with parents and early caregivers.
Are there any more questions?
She's asking about, to paraphrase, perfectionism and clothing choice. First of all, there's no doubt that perfectionism plays itself out in the domain of appearance, including the clothes that you wear. And absolutely, your proposed intervention, I think, is a relevant one. I'm smiling because I've used it before. You can see perfectionists who, in lay terms, would be really matchy-matchy, like everything's perfectly laid out from the tip of their head to the bottom of their feet. And so, yes, you need to get them to expose themselves to the world in an imperfect way, to show up to class with no makeup and track pants on and a dirty shirt, to confront those fears and to figure out that no one really cares. No one's going to run away from you screaming if you don't have your outfit perfectly matched. And so that's part of an overall strategy you can use with some perfectionists to confront their fears and just see what happens. Other perfectionists, they won't touch that at all. That's a don't go zone. And unfortunately, that's not really a good prognostic indicator for treatment if they won't confront their fear of displaying themselves imperfectly to others.
What I'm hearing here as well is the whole thing of self-awareness. So when I catch myself doing some little thing or whatever, that this perfection is at the root of it, and to change, just to catch myself and maybe take a different approach than I would if I were just doing it unconsciously.
I think absolutely bringing things that have been outside your awareness into your awareness are important. I will say to my perfectionists, look, there'll be these little fork in the road moments in your day and in your life, and you can do what you always did, which is turn left. You know, that's the route, you just turn left. You're a left turn specialist, you always turn left. And if you're always turning left, you're also always moving around in circles. And so, yeah, you catch yourself along the way and you realize, okay, I'm not going to turn left again. I'm going to try and turn right today and see how that goes. And then if you can get a little bit more flexible, a little bit more variable in your course, you're all right. But a lot of perfectionists are left turn specialists. They have certain patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that they just do repetitively, even though they're moving in circles.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
You mentioned about one of the remedies to perfection is acceptance. When the perfection goes beyond the person, the family, and becomes cultural, how in your practice or like your study, how has acceptance been accepted by the perfectionists?
That's a good question. I like that one. How has perfectionism being accepted? How is acceptance being accepted by perfectionists? And I'm laughing and smiling because initially they loathe the idea of accepting anything. To them, it's some sort of doormat, defeatist strategy that you would accept reality for what it is. Instead, you have to control it and change it and perfect it. But I think what you offer for perfectionists is an understanding that some things you're going to have to accept, because that's probably the only way out of the hell that you're dealing with, to accept some things. And, there are other areas where committed action is indicated. And let's figure out what you can change and you can control and what you can't. And then let's get you to stop banging your head off the wall trying to change things that you should be accepting. So you help people differentiate where they should be putting their effort. And oftentimes where they should be putting their effort is that area where their values live and where they're really passionate about it, and get them to go in that direction, and then just get them to accept, even though it might be quite painful, those things that they're probably never going to be able to change. I thank you all for your questions and your enthusiasm.
So on behalf of the Dalhousie Faculty Association, Dr. Sherry, we'd like to thank you so much for giving this talk. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
I want to thank, in addition to the Dalhousie Faculty Association, the Halifax Central Library for their support in this. And I want to thank you all for coming out. There are refreshments up at the front, so please come up and have some food and chat. Thank you very much.